Uh, okay, hello everybody. Good evening. I hope you guys are okay, survived the tsunami and everything from today. Um, so just welcome. My name is Steve McKay. I'm a professor of sociology and I direct the Center for Labor and Community, and just have the pleasure of sponsoring tonight's talk. This event is partly put on through the Center of Labor and Community with our partners, the Monterey Bay Labor Council. In 2022, we were able to expand labor studies across California, including here at Santa Cruz. The center's mission is really to advance a research agenda that builds a fighting labor movement. And so part of that agenda is really bringing people here, working with community, and providing the kind of research that can be actionable and really make a difference. Part of that, we're expanding. We're different kind of programming, including events like tonight. We're also excited to be introducing our new program director, Sarah Mason. Come out, Sarah. Very soon to be Dr. Sarah Mason, but we have about a week more. So Sarah will be taking on, and so between us, again, the idea of a Center for Labor and Community is to sort of bridge the academia with activism and with the labor movement. So the Labor Center is doing a number of different projects. You can learn about some of our work out on the table out there. One example is the Young Worker Study. So Veronica Hamilton, where's Veronica? She's around. I think she's probably out still organizing. Grad student, also soon to be doctor, but she has been running the Young Worker Study, which is, there's Veronica. Yay. And the Young Worker Study, they collected last year with a group of undergrads over 2,000 surveys of young people across Santa Cruz County to learn about what it's like to be a young worker here, and again, toward thinking about a pipeline to the labor movement. We also run Labor Summer, and Sarah has run that over the last year, where we pair UCSC undergrads with labor unions and labor organizations. We give our students a pipeline into the movement that way. Just want to give a special thanks shout out to Vicente Vega. Vicente, yay. He's our program and research coordinator, and he really did a lot of legwork tonight to bring you all here. Just want to thank our other sponsors, the Monterey Bay Central Labor Council, the UAW Region 6, Institute for Social Transformation, the Sociology and the Environmental Studies Department, the Center for Critical Urban and Environmental Studies, the Center for Reimagining Leadership, and Rachel Carson College. So all units, again, what we're trying to do at the Center for Labor and Community is to be a hub, both for the scholarship, but also for the community activism. I do want to note, unfortunately, one of our authors and speakers, Saket Soni, had a family emergency, so he's unable to join us this evening. We wish his family well, and we're only sorry he's not able to join us to share about his book, The Great Escape, and hear more about his work with the Resilience Force, which is a labor-oriented nonprofit that he founded and directed. Just what we're going to do tonight, we have a little bit more time with our two guests. Our moderator, who I'll introduce in a moment, will pose 3 sets of questions to facilitate a conversation with our other author, each section about 20 minutes. So we'll have a nice long conversation between the two. And then we'll have a little bit of time, about 15 minutes or so at the end, for questions and answers. Because we are recording the event tonight, we'll have someone with a mic going around. So if you have a question, we'll gather some, but we'll ask you to speak into the mic. And we also want to welcome those online. So we had about 220 people from around the country who wanted to sit in tonight virtually. So we want to welcome all our folks online. And then following the question and answers, we'll have a little bit of time to sign books. So in the back, they'll be selling and signing books. And then we'll, in room 4, just outside in the next room, we'll have a small reception and food, so you can go, please grab food and drinks, and you can bring them back here if you want to meet the author, so we'll have a little bit of time. And we can go to about 8:30, okay? And then just want to introduce, finally, our speakers and who are, so Mijin Cha, who we'll hear about, got her JD from UC Hastings College of Law and her PhD from the University of London SOAS. She was a previously associate director at PolicyLink. She was a senior policy analyst at Demos, and now she's assistant professor of environmental studies at UCSC. She's also a fellow at the Climate Jobs Institute at Cornell and a fellow at the Climate and Community Institute. Mijin is the author of the very recently, tonight is the first time she even saw her book, released from MIT Press, titled A Just Transition for All, Workers and Communities for a Carbon-Free Future. And she'll be in conversation with Keith Brower-Brown. He has a PhD in geography from UC Berkeley. He researches the politics of climate crisis, Latinx movements, and construction labor in California's San Joaquin Valley. When he was a grad student, he was a steward with the UAW at Berkeley, and he's now the labor climate organizer at Labor Notes, which is the media and organizing network for rank and file activists. And he's also an affiliate with the UC Berkeley Labor Center. So please welcome Mijin and Keith.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Well, first things first, A Just Transition for All is released and physically present here. Let's all give a warm round of congratulations and thanks to Mijin for this. 15 years of work around green jobs, climate movements, environmental justice movements leading up to this. So a lot of contributions in here to learn from for all of us. And you know, the obvious place to start is just transition. What are we talking about here? How would you define it, and why does it matter as a framework for us?
Thank you, Keith. And I also have a couple of thank yous, if you don't mind. First, thank you, Keith. I know it was a heroic effort to get here today. We really appreciate it. And thank you to Steve and Vicente and Sarah and Veronica and the Center for Labor and Community. This is like so much cooler than I could have even imagined. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. And I'd also thank the co-sponsors, particularly the Center for Reimagining Leadership and the Environmental Studies Department, the staff at MIT Press, and then all of you for coming. This is just so amazing. Thank you all for coming today, and for all my friends and comrades and colleagues, particularly my comrades at the Center for Community, Climate and Community Institute, and to Hannah and Edie for keeping me sane this week. And then thank you to my mom and dad who are also here, so please say hello afterwards. So I think, you know, probably many of us have heard of this idea of just transition, and as it becomes more popular, what I am noticing is also it's becoming more neoliberalized. What is actually a pretty radical and transformative idea is being kind of into something really small and narrow, and there are even people who say that any kind of renewable energy generation is a just transition. And in fact, what I argue in the book is that there are two elements to a just transition, and they sound kind of obvious and ridiculous, but first is that there has to be a transition. And this is extremely important in this time because what we see is that there is a huge amount of growth in renewable energy, which is true, but there is also a huge amount of growth in oil and gas production. And the US, for instance, is now the top oil and gas producing nation in the world. So we produce more oil and gas than Saudi Arabia and Russia. So what we're seeing is that what sociologists have called an energy addition. So we're just generating more energy, but none of it is actually displacing any fossil fuel energy. So for there to be a just transition, first we have to transition away from fossil fuels. And this is, I think, something that is really fundamental, but there has to be a drawdown of fossil fuel extraction and use. There's really no way to get around this fact, and I think people who say that we can do both, it's completely false. We have to transition away from fossil fuels. So then I think the question becomes, how do we make it just? And the argument is that then justice should dictate the conditions of the energy transition. And it will look different everywhere. And I think what we want to get away from is this prescriptive idea of if you do X, Y, and Z, you'll have a just transition. And in fact, the conditions in different places and different areas and regions require different things to make it just. But what I argue in the book is that fundamentally, we must move from a system of extraction to a system of regeneration. So a lot of folks think that if we just replace fossil fuels with renewable energy, then that will be a just transition. But in fact, you can kind of see what's happening now if we take the electric vehicle sector, for instance. It's not a just transition to have electric vehicles considering how much lithium they require and how big, especially in the US, the electric vehicles are becoming. So we have to have this systemic and institutional change moving away from this concept of extraction to one of a regenerative model. And that also means that we have to move away from extraction in all of its forms. So extraction of people through incarceration, extraction of resources, and extraction of wealth through abusive financial practices. I think that is harder for climate people to understand, but the argument is that if you have extraction on any level, you will always have a climate crisis. Because for extraction to occur, you need to see populations as being disposable, and as soon as any population is disposable, then you'll have things like sacrifice zones, climate areas, those kind of things. So we have to move away from extraction in all of its forms towards systems of regeneration for there to be a just transition.
Well, I'm very persuaded. But the tough question here, of course, is how could mass movements, workers who are directly affected, and communities around them be persuaded? It's such an important question here that you engage with in the book. And I'm curious how you think of this tension between putting forward principles up front, as you just did around needing to move from extraction to regeneration as a model for our economy, with what you also said about that we can't have a one-size-fits-all vision of just transition because it needs to be formed in movement. It needs to be formed from the ground up, bottom up, through movement work. How do you see the role of yourself in this book as a scholar and activist in like putting forward a vision that can then help that movement building process?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And I know, Keith, you also have some insights on this, so I'd love to hear what you think as well. I think a really important thing to think about, and one that the late Luke Cole told me, who was one of my first mentors, was that we all have a role to play, right? And we all have a role to play, but we all have to also understand that none of us is more important than the other. So he would always say, he was a lawyer, he would say things like lawyers on tap, not on top. And so I think as academics, as activists, as researchers, we all have a role to play, and understanding what our role is, I think, is really important. And sometimes I think, particularly in climate change, we rely too much on the rational brain, right? So I talk about in the book this idea of listen to the science, which is, I find to be such an ineffective slogan. Because basically you don't want the action to be to listen, right? Like listening to the science doesn't really get us anywhere. You want people to do something. But it's also that people just are not moved by science. And we can be upset about this, or we can, argue about it. But the truth is that people are moved by values and their own material needs. And so when we think about this idea of community and organizing, something that I argue in the book is that a reason to have this diverse coalition, what I call, is because you need to meet people where they're at and what they're really interested in. So if we were talking about things like millions metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions reductions, that is largely meaningless to everybody, especially because in the US we don't use the metric system, so what is a metric ton? If instead you say, workers who work outside, it's getting, the heat is unbearable, this is a workers' rights issue. Workers' rights issues are climate issues, right? And so we have to get away from thinking that climate change is only about sea level rise, which it is of course about sea level rise, but why do we care? Because it will displace millions of people, right? And the harm that it will cause. And so what I really see is that especially in this time when we're facing some really difficult political conditions, is we need movements. We were talking about the labor movement. We need strong movements. We need a lot of organizing because we need to build power. And I argue that the way you build power is either through money or through people. And we'll just never have as much money as the other side, so we need people. And the way you bring people in is you start talking about things that they care about and about how to make their lives better. And that's really fundamentally what climate advocacy is about, right? How can we make people's lives better?
So part of what you're hoping to do is sort of put forward a program that people can recognize themselves in and see like this is a better life that's envisioned in this program, that this isn't just about tons of gas in the atmosphere. This is about like concrete changes in my everyday life. Do you see like in the history of just transition efforts, you do a lot of great case studies in this book where you're looking at from the oil and chemical and atomic workers who devised this idea and term in some ways for the first time in the US in the 70s and 80s to more recent cases. Are there some that stand out where you feel like they did a really good job of sort of collectively articulating just transition and building a lot of broad support for it?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the origins of just transition are, of course, with the late, great labor leader Tony Mazzocchi, and who actually worked at that time with environmental justice movements as well. And what Mazzocchi argued was that, as the head of the Oil and Chemical Atomic Workers Union, there are some industries that are too toxic for society to continue. So as we move away from them, though, that burden should not fall on workers and communities. And I think now we can argue that climate change is such that the fossil fuel industry is too toxic to continue. And so as we move away from the fossil fuel industry, though, it should not be those workers and communities that bear that brunt of transition. The schematic that I use in my book is from an organization, a community-based organization in Oakland called Movement Generation. And they talk about this model of extraction to regeneration. So the extractive model is centered on profits, and regeneration is really centered on well-being. So I think a challenge of just transition is that since we have not really transitioned away from fossil fuels, we don't really see these examples of a vibrant just transition. But what I can say is that doing research in fossil fuel areas is that when communities do things like reimagining or envisioning exercises for the future, fossil fuels are very rarely within that vision. And it's more about how can we have a strong community. You know, one of the policy proposals I suggest is diversifying local economies so that we're not monodependent upon the fossil fuel industry or any industry. And I think it's important to remember that, you know, even people who work in fossil fuels are the same victims of the fossil fuel economy that we all are. And that, you know, a lot of times people try to argue that fossil fuels pay better than other industries, but we have to remember that the reason why they pay better is because they had these very violent, bloody conflicts with the fossil fuel industry. So the industry in and of itself is not a benevolent employer, but through worker struggle has been made a better employer than other industries. And so likewise, I think we can see now, through the same kind of worker struggle, making sure that renewable energy and oncoming low carbon industries are good employers will be really crucial to create this proof of concept that we can transition in a way that doesn't leave people behind.
Beautifully said. Yeah, I want to sit with a second with the Mazzocchi and the oil, chemical, and atomic workers and some lessons that, if I can jump in, really stick with me from that. I think it's kind of humbling to realize that this idea of just transition has been around for almost 5 decades in some form, and that people have been fighting for it. That's both encouraging. It's great that, you know, we're not starting from scratch, but also humbling in that, like, we can't just come up with this idea and change the world, you know, off the bat with it. We've got to like learn some hard lessons of what hasn't worked. And for the oil, chemical, and atomic workers, this sort of health and safety fight was really successful for them. That the passage of OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration in the United States, happened because OCA, this union, had a vision that they, you know, were front line before that term was in wide use, that they were being affected 10 times more every day on the job than the communities around them. And so they could find a shared interest with the communities around refineries and chemical plants. And they campaigned for OSHA. There were really creative road shows or road tours that researchers and scientists partnered with the union to like do discussions with workers about the chemical exposures they're facing every day. I think it's a really cool model for what academics and scholars can do to contribute to the labor movement, is this sort of participatory science and discussion. And they ended up building the pressure to pass OSHA by building a lot of other labor support and early environmental movement support in that period. But it was really hard to transfer that to just transition. Even after that success, that it's one thing to take on an immediate sort of health and safety risk in the workplace, and I think we've seen labor movements succeed on that front, and that's often a source of fights, like for the San Bernardino giant Amazon air hub that handles Most of the Amazon packages that go by air on the West Coast right now is attempting to unionize right now, just announced their drive towards a union election. And climate issues are a huge part of what got them started, was exposure to 114-degree temperatures out on the tarmac. Exposure to wildfire smoke led them to do marches on the Boss multiple times in the last 2 years. But then to go from that sort of fight over safety to we want to steer a climate transition, building that bridge, I think, is kind of the essential challenge that at Labor Notes I see a lot of workers struggling with, how to help their coworkers take a step on that bridge. I don't think we figured it out, and I think a lot of the ideas in this book are trying to help build some of the next bricks in that bridge, or like give some ideas for how we could do that. So to kick it back to you, is there anything else that you feel like is sort of essential to lay out about background of this concept of just transition, or should we jump to the 4+ pillars and that heart of the book?
I think your example is so well taken, because what is important to remember is that transition in and of itself is not unjust, right? Like, as economies and societies mature, we expect industries to evolve and so on and so forth. Our inability to support people through that transition is what makes transition unjust. And so, but I think it's important to remember that these are all manufactured conditions. Like, there's nothing inherently unjust about the way that we live. It's just that we have chosen these policies, right? We have chosen to create a billionaire class when it should be non-controversial that every billionaire is a moral and political failure. So it's just that, so we can have a just transition. We just have to make different decisions. But it is not something that is so out of the ordinary. I always have to have some kind of dig at Elon Musk. If you took all of Elon Musk's money, you could actually have a very good transition fund. Then you could take that money and you could give it, for wage replacement. You could do, healthcare for displaced workers. So many things. So the problem is that it's not that we don't have a shortage of ideas, or even necessarily a shortage of resources. We have a real lack of priority. And so we just have to reprioritize so that we're no longer putting capital over people, but putting people over capital. And then a just transition is, not that hard.
Let's make it happen. Elon, if you're watching this, we're coming. So a real core of the book, a major contribution, is the 4+ pillars, which is an elaboration of concepts and frameworks you had built as the 4 pillars with Dr. Manuel Pastor earlier work. Could you tell us a bit about what these pillars are? And I love how you sort of evaluate a set of different cases using these pillars, and I would love to hear some of those examples.
Sure, yeah. And I should definitely shout out Dr. Manuel Pastor, who is one of my mentors, and I did a lot of this research with. And the first project we did together was for environmental justice communities in California who were maybe not necessarily climate focused, but whose members would be really impacted by climate. And they, I think something else that's really important was thinking through how can we have a proactive action plan and not just reactive. So not just let other people decide what would be best for us, but what would it look like to have a proactive just transition plan? And so we looked at case studies across the country and across the world to really think about, in sites of transition, are there elements in which a more just transition can advance? And so we came up with these 4 pillars. The first being strong governmental support. And here I want to make sure to note that it's not a blind faith in the public sector, because often the state is the one that is creating injustice. So we don't mean it as like we should just blindly, state is always good. But if we think about the challenge between, or the conditions of a private sector-driven transition, which is what we're currently living through, or a public sector-led transition, the private sector is just a fact, is driven by profit. And a lot of these things are not profitable. So for instance, if you're trying to redevelop an area that is fossil fuel dependent, you are looking at a 10 to 20 year investment, and it's unclear when that investment will pay off. That is impossible for the private sector, right? And then a lot of supports that will be needed, like wage replacements, like healthcare, all of those things are already done through the public sector. So we really see a strong governmental support as necessary for a just transition. The second component is a dedicated funding stream. And I talk a lot in the book about the Trade Adjustment Act, which is one of the few transition policies that exist. And it arose as globalization and deindustrialization was occurring. One of the reasons why the TAA was not as effective as it could have been was it had really inconsistent funding because it depends upon congressional authorization. And so obviously when Democrats are in power, it's better funded. When Republicans are in power, it's less funded. And then it actually was expired in 2023. So that inconsistent funding is really difficult when we're thinking about retraining and placing workers in new jobs. You need kind of that consistent funding stream, especially if you're thinking about things like redeveloping communities. The third is economic diversification, as I mentioned earlier. One of the reasons why this is so challenging is because these areas are monodependent upon one industry. So when that industry goes away, all the jobs go away, all the money for schools, roads, all goes away. But if you have a more diversified economy, then you can kind of absorb those shocks a little bit better. And the last is strong and diverse coalitions. And this is really both the power part, but also ensuring that the policies that we're creating are actually addressing the concerns that people have. Top-down policymaking is not great. That's how you get things like coal miners should be coders. No. When you there's nobody that knows better what communities and workers need than communities and workers. And so when you build those coalitions from the ground up and you build your policy from the ground up, you're also, one, you're making sure that you're actually addressing needs, and two, you're building in political power as you go along. So those were our original 4 pillars. But then as I thought about it a little bit more, I thought those are necessary but not sufficient for a just transition, because you can have all those elements and still exist within the systems that we have now. And so I really, learning from abolitionist scholars and from labor scholars, thought a lot about this idea of non-reformist reforms. So the idea is that we're working within the system, but to eventually move away from the system. And I think an easy to understand example is, for instance, if we move money from a police budget to something like supportive community housing or other community-based community-based programs, you're both helping to create a separate accountability program while also winding down this extremely abusive extractive sector. So non-reformist reforms works within the system, but with the eventual goal of moving to something different. And then I think we can think about being on the path for a just transition. So the example that I put in the book is probably going to cause a lot of people to get mad. But I compare the Inflation Reduction Act, which was just passed this last year, I think, 2022, sorry. And as often lauded as the best climate and biggest climate program ever passed. That is true largely because there has never been any meaningful federal climate program before. So it's better than zero. But it puts all of its efforts and all of its faith in the private sector. So it's largely a tax credit-based effort, and an analysis by McKinsey was clear that the top benefactor from the IRA will be corporations. So even if it's not a good way to build out the renewable energy sector, because now what we see is that a lot of people are freaking out that the tax credits will be revoked, right? And you can compare that with something like the Building Public Renewables Act, which was passed in New York State, which then authorizes their public authority, the Public Power Authority, the New York Power Authority, to build their own renewables. So what that does is, one, they already have a unionized workforce, so you ensure that that work is going union. And two, you're breaking the private sector monopoly on utility power. My comrade Isaac is here, and they know much more about public power, so please feel free to ask them about this after. But basically, if we look at the two IRA versus BPRA, you can see how IRA, it doesn't really leverage the power and of the public sector, right? And we could think of something different, like the federal government itself could just build renewable energy. That'd be great. Instead, it's a lot of tax credits to private companies to then build renewable. So even from a political standpoint, when you think about if you have a job in the renewable energy sector, you're going to think that your employer is the one that gave you the job, not that it was because of government incentives that you've gotten this job. And so when we think about this past election and how people don't really see what government can do, this is a really clear example of you're letting the private sector take credit for something that is a government action. Much better to just have the public sector do it, like the BPRA. And also then you break out of this profit-driven model, right? Because public utilities don't have the same structure that private utilities do. Private utilities have to make money. All of us are beholden to PG&E, which is horrible, right? Our electricity goes out all the time. That is literally their job. And so I think when we think about what we could have gotten and what it could have been versus what it is, there's just a huge gap.
So it sounds like the non-reformist reform idea is really key in sort of guiding what sort of policies we should aim for. And this seems to me like a really tricky question for a lot of movements. As soon as you get, if you're open to trying to elect people or push within the system, it it's very hard to win almost anything. And so then the question is it good enough to go for this sort of small win for this reform gain? So this is sort of trying to parse, are there moments where you've seen activists or movements sort of face that choice of like taking a compromise that doesn't end up being this sort of non-reformist reform that you think just ends up sort of not being noticed by anybody and then doesn't end up changing power and who has it in society? Like, do you have some moments you were thinking of as you were writing this? The IRA is one. I'm curious if either in that case or in others, you can think of the way that movements participated and like set their sights too low for something that wasn't really changing the balance of power.
Yeah, the last big push for climate legislation was the Markey-Waxman bill in 2010, I think, which would have established a federal cap-and-trade program. And instead of a movement-based approach, it was really an inside baseball insider game. So they really tried to work with congressional offices and make as many compromises as possible because thinking that it would be an easy win. It failed spectacularly and set back the climate movement about 10 years because they ignored environmental justice concerns, they ignored movement concerns, and really just did the most technocratic approach, and it just didn't go anywhere. So I understand that it's very hard to win anything. I totally agree. But the BPRA, for instance, the Building Public Renewables Act, it took 4 years. It took an electoral strategy to flip a couple of seats to more friendly legislators. It took a public awareness campaign, media campaign. Public power is not something that I think when you say people are like, oh my God, I'm so excited about this. But a media campaign can really help understand why it's important because what people do understand is that their energy bills are very high. Right, and so when you start talking about it that way, and also if you live, for instance, next to a peaker plant, which are plants that go, when they need more electricity, they're extremely polluting, right? So when you start to talk about it in ways that people can understand, I think you then understand why the bigger win is the better win, right? And so in the book, I talk about, for instance, this community in Arvin, California, which was part of this Center for Race, Poverty, and Environment's advocacy. They passed the first in-state setback law, which means that you can't do oil and gas drilling within, I think theirs was 600 feet of sensitive places, so hospitals, schools, churches, which means that before this was passed, you could literally drill in front of a hospital. And I don't know if many of you have been around drilling, but when I took my students on, they call it a toxic tour of the Central Valley, they all immediately got headaches because there's so much natural gas that is just released from the drilling operations. But people live like that, right? So they passed this setback bill. It took an electoral campaign to get different people in office. And then even when it was passed, it took, as my friend Caroline Farrell says, straight up harassing the city attorney to enforce it. All of these things, it's very challenging, but they did get the first setback law, which then laid the ground for the statewide setback law, which is 2,500 feet, right? So these small wins can add up to bigger wins. But I think the question for folks or for advocates is not what is the best thing that we could win, but what do we need to win, right? Like so often when you have these conversations with people who spend too much time in DC, all they care about is bipartisanship. But bipartisanship is never the goal, right? We are here to stop the climate crisis. That is the goal. Bipartisanship, as long as it can get us there, fine. But the goal is not bipartisanship, right? We should think about what do we need to stop the climate crisis and move and work from there. But if we are already starting from a place of like, let's just get solar production tax credits, and then what, right? But if you think about like a much bigger, broader, ambitious program, then you are actually doing things that change people's lives for the better. And that is always successful and popular.
You make this case in the book that by passing policy that is sufficiently transformative. Maybe it's not, taking all of Elon's money just yet, but it's still, something like the setback law in Arvin. By passing those sort of non-reformist reforms, you make the case that then that helps movement build, that people recognize that they've received the benefits of that the stakes of power in their lives has shifted in some way, and there's more reason to be involved and to organize than before. That is a case, I think, that inspires a lot of activists out there right now in some ways, especially people who are trying more progressive or democratic socialist like electoral work out there. But there's a hot debate about how does that work? Where has this happened? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you've seen in Arvin or in other places that sort of feedback loop happen, where people witness the effects of policy as a reason to be involved and organize in a new way.
Yeah, and I want to also acknowledge that it's very difficult, and we lose much more than we win. I think it's really important to understand and accept that, and that sometimes, though, you do win by losing, which I know sounds really cheesy, but it is true that many of the stories in the book, it is multiple year attempts, right? Almost nothing you win on the first try, but you try, then you learn, then you organize, then you build, and then you try again, and probably you'll lose. Then you try again, and then you organize, and then you build. I think the Arvin example is a great example. I think, shutting down coal-fired power plants, I think, could be done in a way where you're working with the union or working with the workers, because they also are suffering from the effects of the coal economy. And those small wins may seem like just a small win here and there, but they really do add up to more than just what we're talking about. And one of the things that I argue about in the Arvin case is that we have had centuries of unabated fossil fuel production and growth. And something like a setback law is the first attempt to say you cannot drill here. It is the first attempt at fossil fuel drawdown. And I think then that built to a statewide example. And we can think about California, for instance, because we are such a big economy, that when we win something like emission standards for cars, we're such a big market that then that just affects the nationwide market. So even though there hasn't been action on the federal level, these state wins have really added up to bigger wins so there has been meaningful climate action, it just hasn't been at the federal level.
So speaking of building meaningful action, I want to come back to the fourth pillar, which is diverse, inclusive coalitions. And the question on my mind reading this is, we're in a more disorganized society in some ways than any generation before, in terms of union membership, in terms of participation in community organizations. The starting point is a challenging one for building movements. How do you see some opportunities out there, or places where people are already talking about issues connected to transitions, where there's already some sort of nascent organization which can be built on towards building this kind of movement program?
Yeah, this is we have to admit we are in a very difficult political time, and I think, at least for myself, we just lost much worse than I thought we would during the election. And I think in the aftermath of it, you saw these things like, okay, we were too generous with trans rights, which never, or what I saw that I really didn't like was people making fun of people who were saying they cared about the cost of eggs, and so it'd be like, this is what you get for the cost of eggs, blah, 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 fascism or whatever. And when people say these things, what they're saying is that they can't afford to live. And that is pretty meaningful. And to make fun of that, you are then isolating people whom you can build with, right? And so what I think is that we are absolutely in this moment where we are lacking community. And I think that's deliberate, right? Capitalism focuses on the individual and tries to make you feel isolated so that that capital then is what is comforting you, not people. But as we all know, you can buy a bunch of stuff and it kind of sucks, but when you spend time with people, you feel better, right? I'm sorry, that was so poorly said, but you know what I mean? And so I think now is the moment when we can really think about, the left, I think right now we can say is very weak, as is again apparent. But our ideas are very popular. Right? And I know this for a fact because when they're on ballot initiatives, things like raising the minimum wage, protecting abortion rates, they more often than not win. So people care about these things. this healthcare CEO that was killed yesterday, the online response was largely about how shitty healthcare is. Sorry, I swear my parents are here. But to me, that is a moment to build, right? Our healthcare system is fundamentally unjust. And when people talk about it, they're not talking about like, what party are you in or any of these things. And so there are ways that we are all being screwed by this billionaire oligarchic class. And I think focusing on those things does actually help build a stronger movement. At the same time, I fully do not agree with abandoning vulnerable people, right? What kind of world are we trying to build when we say, we'll worry about your rights, we'll protect you later? That is not the world we are trying to build. And so I think what we can do is build community here. Everybody, again, all of you are so lovely. Thank you so much for coming. But there are spaces in which we can come together. And I think that is where you start to build together, right? And so when I say also that it will look different everywhere is that, the concerns that we might have are different than concerns other communities will have, but we can build on that concern. And then when you build together with somebody, you build that trust for the harder win, right? You cannot go in as the first campaign you have, never having talked to anybody, never having built with anybody, and telling someone we're gonna shut down this plant, we're gonna take over your job. You cannot start there, right? You need to build that trust, you need to build that community, and understand that we are in this fight together, right? We are in this fight together. I have your back, you have my back. And that means that if you are trans, I will stand with you. And we cannot abandon our most vulnerable people. And through that building of strength, we will become stronger. But we cannot just say, whenever it becomes inconvenient, we're gonna ditch whoever we're gonna ditch, right? What kind of movement is that? What kind of future are we trying to build? But we have to stand next to each other and stand up for each other. And I think now is the time when maybe we focus less on the national and more on the community and building a community. And then from a community, you can build a bigger community, and then you can build more power. And then you can think about how we can have much wider, much bigger wins.
One thought I was thinking as you were exploring the role of community organizing alongside labor organizing and building around transitions was that some of the most bright spots in the union movement in the last couple of decades have been for workers, not in factories, but in reproductive labor, care labor, in healthcare, and childcare, and education. Some of the most militant sectors. The teachers' union movement really, kicked off a strike wave across the whole country in a lot of ways in the last decade. So I'm curious how you see, that sort of realm of care labor as a realm in which some of this organizing could happen, because it's at this intersection of where people are feeling the impacts of extraction or pollution, as well as getting more organized than before.
Yeah, I think that's such a great question. And also, I think an important thing to note is that care work and teachers, these are all low carbon sectors, right? And they're place-based jobs. They're never really included when people talk about climate jobs, but they're absolutely a climate job. And when we think about transitioning away from fossil fuels, we have to think about place-based job creation, because people don't want to move from where they are. And so when we think about what can be developed where they live, care and education, right? Wherever you go, you need those two sectors. So we should really be focusing on how to make sure that those are good jobs, they're unionized jobs, and they provide protections for workers. I think the teachers union is a great example. And for instance, in Chicago, they've done a great job of, like, while they're organizing, ensuring that their schools are climate safe, right? I think it's a great way of integrating health issues, education issues, worker issues, and understanding how climate will impact all of us. And I think similarly in LA, the teachers union not only was talking about climate change, but also getting cops off campus. And then you can see how it's like a much more holistic view of how do we make our learning environments more safe for our students. And that goes beyond just curricular issues. And so I think teachers unions are amazing. And I think it's also an easy way when I ask my students, how many of you know someone who works in a union? The most common answer is teachers. And so it's a way for people to understand what a union does. I'm a member of our own union. Shout out to Debbie. And so unions are, the way that people build where they work and can then build to bigger wins. And I think the teachers are also, when we think about Wisconsin, for instance, they kicked off all those strikes, and now public sector is back under collective bargaining, right? So maybe we lose at the time, but if we keep fighting, we will eventually win. And I think teachers' fights are a great example of that.
Coming back to a point you made earlier about the necessity of drawing down fossil fuel use and extraction. you mentioned that oil and gas production is higher than it's ever been in the United States. And we've seen both parties, at least when they're in office, be pushing that agenda and building up under both, in the White House at least. So a question on my mind has been, how do we popularize an idea of a transition when it seems like there's been something of a political consensus, at least at the elite level, around avoiding this kind of path. And there's certainly been some popular level of that too, of a sort of vision of freedom that's based on cheap energy, on like, however dirty it is, your privatized transportation system, working very far from home. There's a lot of like material reinforcement in people's lives that you want a low gas price as like an experience of freedom to do with what's left on your paycheck after that. What do you think are ways of like connecting this to an alternative vision of freedom and contending with the very real challenges that there are like more costs in some ways and in some immediate ways potentially with the transitions we're working towards?
I mean, I think cost is a really great question, because I think it's a question of who's bearing that cost, right? So the cost of fossil fuels for many workers and communities is already very high. And using your example of commuting, for instance, there's all this polling that shows that people actually really hate commuting an hour or more. They really hate driving, but that's just how we've created our cities, right? And so when we think about the non-reformist reform aspect of, if we just replace every internal combustion engine with an EV, then we're just perpetuating this miserable system. But instead, if we had meaningful public transportation, we just talked about every time I drive over Highway 17, I get so angry that there isn't a train. There's even a tunnel through the mountain, that could be a train. But those things make our lives better, and eventually will be cost effective, but even in the immediate term are cost effective, because we have to think about, again, who is bearing this cost. So the people who are dying from air pollution, which is a direct result of fossil fuel combustion, are already paying this cost. So often when people talk about cost, they're always thinking about what happens in the future, but I am concerned about what happens with people who are already here. And that cost is already too high. And so I think, to your point about it being a bipartisan consensus, the reason why there's so much oil and gas production now is because President Obama lifted the ban on oil and gas exports. And you see it direct, right? And he even continues to brag about it, right? And this all of the above energy, it should really only be some of the above. And so I think oftentimes, this climate discussion gets derailed by cost, but remember, again, we could just take the money from Elon. But even more than that, like if we think about the IRA, for instance, there are billions of dollars for hydrogen production. What if there was billions of dollars for public transit build out, right? So there is money, it's just we're spending it in different ways. And so I think people don't want to talk about the fossil fuel drawdown, because then we're talking about guaranteed job loss, and that I know that is very challenging for a lot of folks. But for instance, the coal sector is already on an unjust transition, right? It's been a downward trend for a long time without any support for those coal communities. And so I think, this idea that cheap energy has made people prosperous is really false. It has made a very small percentage of people very rich, and the rest of us have borne the cost of our fossil fuel economy.
When you're reviewing that history of unjust transition in Appalachia around coal, you cite some research I had never come across before that was really fascinating. I think Aventa was the name of the researcher, around how coal communities, how workers and their families come to identify with coal companies, despite being on the losing end of this unjust transition of job loss. Could you say a little bit more about like what key lessons you took from that, and what you think are ways to sort of split that relationship of identifying with your employer or identifying with fossil capital in this case?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was also really eye-opening for me. So for instance, in West Virginia, it's a lot of this soft indoctrination, right? So the coal company sponsors a softball team. The coal company gives them all their uniforms. Even here in California, the Bakersfield High School mascot is the Drillers. So it's just ways that they start to ingrain fossil fuels into your identity. And it definitely works with coal miners, people who are generational coal miners, they have that as part of their identity. And I think what is helpful for folks who are outside the region to understand is that, so when you go in and you immediately start demonizing coal or the fossil fuel industry, people take it as you're personally demonizing them. And the conversation doesn't really go much further. But at the same time, when people who are coal miners in Appalachia, there's like a 100% chance that you're going to get black lung disease. So they're also not blind to the dangers of the coal industry. But there has been no alternative for them to transition to. And so I think it's a very different situation if you have an industry that is booming, that provides the same kind of jobs and provides the same kind of opportunities, and then you talk about winding down the coal industry. But what we're doing right now is asking people to take a leap of faith into an unknown future in a country that has no economic safety net. And so I think those conditions are just impossible for this kind of organizing. So things that, in the book, what we talk about, one of the Kentucky advocates was saying that the greatest transition policy that they've had there is the Affordable Care Act, for all of its flaws, but it does allow people to have health insurance if you don't have a job. And so it really shows how material considerations are really fundamental to a just transition.
And that's speaking to the Medicaid expansion elements of the ACA. Gotcha. Yeah. Just to share, I think this theme of wanting to stay in place that you mentioned earlier is an interesting one to come back to on this question of community transition. I was just in Bakersfield a month ago working on research, talking to union activists and others there. And Bakersfield area, has a huge amount of oil production. One of the highest oil producing counties in the state is Kern. And it also has had some of the fastest solar growth in the state in the last decade, where what's special about solar in California compared to most of the rest of the country is that's been unionized almost from the start of the utility scale solar sector here. And part of that's because unions had built up a lot of power for years and backed the renewable energy mandates in California from the start, so long as they could ensure that it would be built in state where they could fight to unionize it. And they did unionize about 90% of it so far. So it seems like this is a hopeful case to what you're speaking to of there needs to be an alternative with good jobs right in place. And yet there's not been much of a political transformation in Bakersfield so far. And the big question that kept coming up was well, what would we transition to? The solar jobs are good. They've helped another 2,000 people maybe make that transition. But there are tens of thousands of people working in the oil fields where it's the one good job you can get straight out of high school with no other training is what people told me, where they're just have built up this idea of you can make $90K, $110K a year, and that goes really far there without an advanced degree. The building trades are kind of an exception, one other path to that. But the question of what is the alternative, I think really comes back to your point about there needing to be public intervention of redistribution of significant funds, probably from the wealthy, because they have a lot of it saved up right now, to building industrial alternatives. And you mentioned care work, education, healthcare is something that can be done in place. Another that comes to mind is landscape restoration and other sorts of remediating landscapes comes up there as capping oil wells, cleaning up oil fields is something where people see the need for that. And I think people's desire to stay in place reflects not just the hassle of moving and not wanting to go through that and not wanting to lose the community, but also some attachment to the landscape and to the ecosystem, and that we should embrace that a lot of people feel a fondness for the river that they go fish in, or the place they go hiking with their kids, or just their daily walk with their dog, that there's something to build on there, and work around healing the landscape might be a piece of that. So that's one path that people talk about there, and the other is carbon capture. And I think you give this really succinct sort of vision for the limits, or the limited cases in which we could use that. So I'd be curious on both of those fronts, as in landscapes transitioning from fossil production. Have you seen any good cases of that sort of remediation path versus the carbon capture path, and when that works or not?
Yeah, I hate CCS. I'll just tell you now. I hate carbon capture. Not a big fan of carbon dioxide removal, of any of these things, until we stop using fossil fuels, right? Because now what they're doing is just perpetuating the lifeline of fossil fuels, which is why I'm against them. And you can hear it now, right? You hear this subtle discourse change where people are talking about we have an emissions problem, not a fossil fuel problem. And if you have an emissions problem, you can just capture the emissions and keep using the fossil fuels. That's what it means. But in fact, we can't. We have to stop using fossil fuels. So when you hear that we have an emissions problem, it immediately for me triggers, you're just trying to perpetuate the fossil fuel industry. And so you're absolutely right. There is a ton of work that has to be done with land remediation, even capping oil wells. There's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done also because the low carbon future it still largely remains to be built. And so if you used to build oil and gas pipelines, maybe you build geothermal pipelines. You know, there are transition paths for these different technologies. I think, you know, some work that I did with Just Transition Listening Project, a project of the Labor Network for Sustainability, looked at this idea of being in place. And economists have this talking point of that people will just move to opportunities. So you don't have to really worry about place-based job creation because people will just move to opportunity. Well, we talked to a bunch of people, about over 100 people who had experienced transition or who are on the brink of transition. And the truth is that the vast majority of them don't move. They just get poorer because there's no opportunities there. Because there are a lot of things that keep you in place, as you pointed out, but the people that can move the easiest are usually the youngest without families. But there's a lot of people who have intergenerational care obligations, people who have attachment to the land. And also, nationwide, it's not great to have just a series of ghost towns, right? Which is kind of what happened in the wake of deindustrialization. So I definitely think there are plenty of jobs that can be created. I think this is another good example of we could just have a public, you know, the Climate Civilian Corps, but on crack, right? Or on steroids, sorry, on steroids. But if we think about the public works programs in the wake of the New Deal, right? All of those, I remember once being in, I think it was either South Dakota or North Dakota, and they have this concrete statue park where there were like concrete dinosaurs made, and you know, it's just public art, but it was a job creation vehicle. And so I think we can absolutely create jobs that are low carbon through the public sector. And I think, you know, the CCS to me is also part of this abundance agenda. Like, we can have it all. We don't have to change the way that we live, except that the way that we live is causing the problem that we're trying to solve. So we actually do have to change the way that we live. And that doesn't necessarily have to be bad, right? Because again, we are living in a world where it looks like on paper we are wealthy because a very few people are very, very wealthy and everybody else is really struggling. So if we look at carbon emissions, for instance, the top 1% of wealth earners, their carbon footprint is enormous compared to everybody else. So we actually can curb that. And so I think first there will be some hard to abate industries like concrete and industrial sectors that we can think about maybe CCS is an okay technology for. But sectors that can be completely decarbonized like electricity, we should just decarbonize them. And things like CCS, you know, basically once you build a carbon capture system on top of a coal-fired power plant, or a gas power plant, you have to operate it for 20 years to recoup that capital cost. So you are just ensuring 20 more years of fossil fuel use. Because if you want to capture carbon, you have to generate carbon. And the way you generate carbon is by burning fossil fuels. And so I think that these are all okay technologies for like getting us at the top, but we have to have substantial reduction in emissions before we can think about capturing whatever few emissions exist.
Well, coming to the present moment where some curveballs have been thrown into climate movements in the last month, one topic is how might the climate movement, what are opportunities and risks it face in either moving towards or away from this kind of vision of just transition? And then on the labor side, I'm curious your thoughts on what are sort of the risks of like where it could head away from this vision or bright spots and opportunities you see.
Yeah, I mean, one of the worst things after the election was seeing was like how quickly so many prominent people in the climate movement shifted to legitimizing fascism, right? And I say this through, for instance, the Chris Wright, who is the nominee for the Secretary of Energy, there were several prominent climate voices that were trying to say that he was a serious energy guy, right? So we can work with him, we can try to figure out how to save parts of the IRA. Chris Wright is an oil and gas executive, and more importantly, he thinks that climate change is a communist hoax. I don't think we can work with him. But my concern more broadly is that what are you doing by legitimizing and normalizing something like this, right? The administration is clear that they want to deport millions of people. So what is the cost that we are bearing by saying that this is a legitimate administration that we can work with? And how many of our vulnerable people are we saying that we don't care about you because we care more about preserving these tax credits? And what kind of broad-based, multiracial, multi-class movement are we building when we say that we don't care about what is almost certain to be the terror that is going to be placed upon your community because we care about saving our hydrogen tax credit. That to me is not a compelling argument. And so I think, the climate movement has always kind of had this tension between the technocratic approach and the more movement-based approach. And I think in the face of authoritarianism, we have to think about, you're not gonna beat an authoritarian regime through technocracy, sorry. Like, Hitler did not come down because we had really amazing regulatory reform, no. So I think that we have to really think about movements and social movements and building social movements, and I think that extends to the labor movement, right? I think for a long time, not to be too critical, but there hasn't been a drive to expand the labor movement, more about protecting what they had and protecting the members that they had, which I understand. But I think we're in a moment when we have to really think about how can we invest in organizing and building that labor power, because even as small as our labor movement is, it is still one of the most powerful social engines that we have. And so building out the labor movement, I see, is fundamental to building a broader, stronger social movement that we can then address the challenges that will come.
Yeah, I fully agree, and think there's a sort of parallel risk in the labor movement. What you point to is the sort of collaborationism risk emerging in the climate movement of like, let's just like save our little program that we lobbied hard to get. In the labor movement, you see Randy Weingarten, head of the American Federation of Teachers, like retweeting Linda McMahon, the new education secretary, about like adopting apprenticeship programs as an alternative to high school. Not the most horrible stuff, but like clearly these efforts to sort of say we can work with you. And Teamsters president Sean O'Brien, infamous already for his dalliances here, but like recently has been really positive about the Secretary of Labor pick, and is notorious for wearing the shirt that says Teamsters versus everybody. And I think that shirt really captures a very dangerous risk out there in the labor movement and in other movements too, once they build a little bit of institutional foothold, that you can look to just defend what you already have and defend your access for the officers and staff and maybe the members of your union, and forget about everybody else. And that can be framed almost as like political independence. I mean, for Sean O'Brien, I think he's like, well, we need to work with everybody. We're not tied to one party. And I think some of us lefties who want like more labor independence from the Democratic Party, myself included, are, we hear labor independence and we're like, but wait, that's not what we meant. We meant the kind where unions work together to set the agenda for politics, rather than going one by one to beg from the boss or the boss's boss's boss, in this case, for scraps for just your little team. And I think that's something to really watch out for and push against in the coming period and on both of these fronts. You pointed to this need for new organizing, and that comes back to this transition topic, I think, in an important way, which is a lot of just transition conversation for decades is focused on industries in decline. Coal mining, even, it had been thought that fossil fuel in general was going to decline, as you have shown and discussed. It's actually picking up, but there's still this sort of idea out there an energy transition might be coming, so fossil fuels at some point might transition down. Where are the opportunities where transition is like building something new? Like where is there a lot of investment coming in where labor has leverage because there's demand for labor? It's hard for workers when your plant is shutting down to push your boss who's like, I was gonna fire you anyway, so all right, shut it down. There are lots of creative things that people do in that situation anyway. Community organizing, holding the equipment of the plant hostage is something Chinese workers have done a lot in the last couple of decades to make sure that a plant closure doesn't just mean like relocation to more exploited workers elsewhere, and they can like get back pay from their boss by holding the equipment hostage. So there's still some leverage there. But there's more leverage, I think, in these places where there's growth, where capital is flowing in and the terms of a new industry are kind of up for grabs. And I'm curious where you see those opportunities out there.
Yeah, I'd be curious to hear what you're seeing too. I think renewable energy is maybe one area. One, because there are several state initiatives like in New York and Illinois that are tying labor standards to renewable energy build out. So any installation over 5 megawatts has to have prevailing wage or any of these other labor standards. And because to your point, capital is flowing into renewable energy. I think the one challenge is that I think when skilled labor is required, you have a little bit more leverage. As many of you probably know, the solar industry now is kind of notorious for not being a great employer and for having really exploitative working conditions. I think this is another area where the IRA could have been better, not to keep harping on the IRA, but they gave an extra tax credit bonus if you employed labor, or if you pay for a living wage or had a unionized workforce. But because it's public money, you can actually require it. So because nobody has a fundamental right to a tax credit, despite what our friend Elon thinks. And so you can put these conditions, and it is a much better way to have public spending. So if you decide to take the tax credit, you must employ union labor, I think is better than we'll give you an extra tax credit if you do what we want you to do. I think some of the maybe geothermal build out also is a way that you could, I think that there's a lot of money going into geothermal. I think those are maybe also jobs that could easily transition if you think about pipeline networks. That seems to be like a more natural fit than asking a coal miner to be a solar installer. That seems harder. And then I think we could think about these low carbon sectors like care and education, and think about how can we really fortify those sectors so that they have strong worker protection and kind of build out from there.
Yeah, those do seem like really important ones to focus on. To expand on the renewable energy one a little bit, they're similar in some ways to the California model. California didn't require union labor, but unions kind of won it through other forms of leverage that they had. In other states, there are outright mandates for union labor, or essentially mandates for union labor, in I think something like 6 states now. And it's been cool to see building trades as well as the rest of the labor movement sort of unite around a vision of like, okay, we want renewable energy, we're gonna make sure it's union labor. There's positive steps, but there's been real challenges, I think, in building like participatory, powerful unions around those jobs. And this is always tough in construction, where people are moving from job site to job site quickly, and you don't know if you're going to have a job in a month or so. And so this sort of the incentives to play nice with your boss and be looking out for your next job next month are really strong in that industry. And I think in the renewable energy industry, that's still a challenge of what gets called business unionism, of like union officials especially really trying to like play nice with contractors or with their managers to make sure they're going to have a job next month is really fierce there for structural reasons. Like there are real incentives that are hard to overcome. Not saying it's just that they're bad people or something. And I think that speaks to the need for there to be reform movements within those unions that are keen both on this sort of broader new organizing to organize the unorganized, as well as standing up to their management. Because if you can't stand up to your own manager on just the terms of your workplace, on safety, on exposure to heat, which is fierce in California solar work. I mean, there are solar contractors in the desert in Southern California building gigawatt solar farms at night now, because heat is so bad during the day. They're like, we're having people suffer heat stroke constantly, no matter how many breaks they gave them or ice water. But there is still not union fight back against those conditions to set the terms themselves. So then having unions set the terms of what they make or of transitioning the content of their work is even further, a step down the line. And that's what I think we really want to try and help foster in the labor movement at Labor Notes, is this vision of first you work with your coworkers to learn how to fight the boss on just like making your work more livable and better. And then it's for the common good. We're changing what we're doing at work. And it's going to be a long and humbling path there, I think, especially in some of these transitioning sectors. But construction, I think, is key, especially for renewables, like you said, and then a couple others keeping an eye on. Our refineries, you mentioned earlier, there's this militant history of the oil, chemical, and atomic workers there, and that won really high standards and some really strong safety programs in a lot of refineries in the country. There's a wave of union busting at refineries right now across the country that is gotten, I think, really underreported and undernoticed, but there is a national bargaining in early part of last year where refinery owners basically decided to just ignore demands and stonewall at the table and like try and outsource a lot of union work. And there's a Teamsters represented refinery on strike in Detroit right now where management is doing the same thing. And I think there's opportunities there when workers are saying, wait, collaborating with our boss all these years has not got us much. Like most of these unions have been kind of in that mode for a couple of decades at the refineries. Now they're seeing like, we've just been in decline. Maybe there's a reason to fight. And while we're fighting, fight for something that has a better future for us than this current model. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, I think this is the argument for the transition to justice, right? Is that can we use this energy transition as a way to leverage to a more just future for everyone?
Totally. One sector that I would also love your thoughts on is the EV and battery sector and how that's developing. Like there's a huge amount of the IRA money went into building out battery and electric vehicle supply chain. And we are seeing some really promising union drive successes in that sector. In particular, there's a GM Ultium battery factory in Ohio and now Tennessee that have successfully unionized, and there's a push to do so at this giant like 5,000 worker or soon to be 5,000 worker Ford Kentucky battery plant. And from kind of what I've heard, like there's some of those projects will not go as far once this public money evaporates, but a lot of it has been built enough at this point that like some amount of batteries are going to keep getting built out, and there's just like some fundamental profits to be had for the auto companies and battery makers by shifting to this model in some cases. So yeah, what are you seeing as possibilities there?
You know, I think the EV sector is another good example of how policy can make bad conditions. So for instance, again, our favorite example, Tesla received these huge bailouts, right? And if we had conditioned their money on labor standards, part of the reason why the EV sector is so challenging is because Tesla is such a huge market player and he is sociopathically anti-union. So we have this barrier to overcome that didn't necessarily have to be there if we had conditioned some of our public money. I think the EV transition, as you say, is already underway. I think we could do better about building bigger and heavier cars, and we should be focusing on smaller, lighter cars. I think, you know, a paper that I'm working on that I think is an interesting thing to think about is the EV sector and battery sector is a great example of if we just had sectoral bargaining, it would be so much easier for everybody. So if you work in battery manufacturing, these are the conditions of your labor. And then we wouldn't have to fight plant by plant by plant, which is what we currently have to do. And I think it's not a coincidence that a lot of these EV battery manufacturing plants are located in the South, which are all right-to-work states, which make organizing all that much harder. But on the flip side, because the UAW has such a stronghold in the big three, it is an easier way for them to transition to union jobs as they have been winning for EV factories. I think, you know, if we could think of a future where, for instance, if you have a contract out, you know, building at one Ford plant, it will just transfer to another Ford plant, even if it is an EV plant, because some preliminary work that we're doing with the Just Transition Listening Project, Critical Minerals, looking at critical minerals in the life cycle of lithium, is that the conditions in EV battery plants are actually quite dangerous. And battery manufacturing is also quite dangerous. There's a lot of chemicals involved. And so you can see that there's a great need for unions because we need this protection for workers because capital will never protect workers against these kind of hazards. And so I think we could think about, again, because there's a way that we could leverage public funding to kind of move the industry towards a more towards a more unionized model. But I think that we will probably see some contraction during the Trump administration as some of these incentives start to go away. But I do think that the trend is clear, and I think that we will go in that direction.
Well, I want us to give some time for audience questions, but I want to see if there's any last theme or contribution you make in this book that you want to make sure you get the chance to sort of say out loud and share.
Yeah. Sure, thanks. I'll say that, it's cold in here. It's so cold. I think what I would hope is that I wrote the book in a way that I would really love if there was community reading groups or worker reading groups, and if anybody online is watching or anybody here and you want to zoom in so we can have a conversation about it, because I think that this idea of just transition is something that is important for everyone. And as my colleague Dimitris Stivis, one of his frameworks is that a true just transition is a more just future for everyone everywhere. So it's not just that we're thinking about my work is domestically focused in the US, but a true just transition is global. And so when we think about something like lithium, for example, displacing our injustice from the US to someplace like Chile or other places where lithium comes from, that can never be a just transition. And so I hope that we can have these conversations about taking care of each other means that we take care of each other across countries, across regions, and across communities.
All right. Well, let's give a round of applause for Mijin and her work here.
Yeah, is this on now? So thank you both again. So we have a little bit of time for a few questions, but we do have food and drinks in the next room. So we'll keep the question and answers a little bit short so that we have time. Again, there'll be, you could buy books, both Saket Soni's book. One of the things we have that's great is Two Birds, which is a new independent bookstore, is back and has agreed to sell books. So thank you, Two Birds.
Yes, thank you so much.
And there'll also be Mijin's book, which you'll also be able to signing books. So you can go after the Q&A. Please, you can get some food and you can bring it back here. And it is about building community. The Center for Labor and Community to be a hub like that. So we'd love to kind of think about hosting a reading or some other follow-up. But for now, we can do a few question answers. I think what we'll do is gather 2 or 3 questions and then have Mijin or Keith answer them. We do want to use the mic, so so just raise your hands and I'll come around because we're recording it. We'd like to use the mic. So questions that people have.
Sorry, one quick thing that you forgot to mention is that we're doing BOGO, buy one, get one. So if you buy Mijin's book, you will get a free copy of Saket Soni's book.
Ooh, yes, and Sockets is a hardcover, so that's good. Okay, questions? Okay.
Thank you so much. In relation to the IRA, there has been now a big push for permitting reform to speed up the capacity for the infrastructure to deliver the all those electrons that we're trying to depend upon instead of fossil fuels. And in that process, there's a lot of questions about the fairness. Hurrying the process for NEPA, for instance, and I'm really wondering what your perspective is on how labor intersects with that, with the concerns of the environmental concerns, especially of permitting reform, that it's being pushed very hard right now.
Do you want to answer that? Or
Sure. I think a very important thing to remember about the permitting reform is that it is sponsored by Joe Manchin and John Barrasso, who is from Wyoming. So the idea that we could get a climate-friendly bill from those two yahoos is not. And so I think we should actually reframe it as what it is, which is deregulation. And what they're trying to do is gut one of the very few tools for environmental justice communities to use, which is the NEPA process. And in fact, when you look at the issue, what is permitting is not what is slowing down the energy transition. There are lots of other reasons. One is understaffing, but the thing that will happen with the permitting reform is that a lot of fossil fuel projects will be greenlit very quickly. And so what we are concerned about is when we think about the fossil fuels build out, when you build new fossil fuel infrastructure, again, you're locking in 10 to 20 years of fossil fuel continued use. And so when they say, what you often hear in the permitting debate is that we accept that there have to be winners and losers. And I think it's very important to ask who wins and who loses. Because the people that are losing are the people that are already losing, because that fossil fuel infrastructure will be built in communities that are already overburdened. And so when we think about this idea of permitting reform, I don't disagree that we need to get renewable energy online faster. I don't think permitting is what's stopping it.
Just to add a couple of thoughts on that, I think transmission interconnection problems are a huge part of what is slowing down bringing renewable energy online. And that speaks to the problems of having this super balkanized, privatized grid out there that is not planned with any kind of rational common good in mind. So, more public utility control or even just like federal transmission work could go a long way in helping address that speed issue. You asked specifically about the labor connection on this. And I think one of the most undersung labor environmental partnerships in practice in California is that CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, which requires permitting for approval of new development, is heavily used by labor as a means of leveraging new development to make sure it's unionized. natural gas plants, there was a building boom in the 2000s, and building trade unions, in many cases, partnered with local environmental justice groups or community organizations to together go and say, we're going to hold up this permit process until we both get something we want out of this. And then that was the template for what they did to get solar unionized in this state. There were other forms of leverage that were important too. I wish they had done more sort of like bottom-up new organizing, but a lot of it was relying heavily on leveraging environmental permitting processes. So we're used to thinking of labor and environment at loggerheads about building new stuff, but in practice, a lot of the time, the permitting process is this place where they come together and say, we have a common interest in setting standards about what world we're going to build out here. And I think whatever happens with NEPA, like we should be under no illusions that we could be losing some important labor leverage in the process if it's gutted in the ways it looks like it might be.
Yeah, and then I'll just add also, they often say that NEPA is the reason why things get delayed, but the projects that they point to are all done, the opposition comes from wealthy people who don't want the wind farm built or whatever. So whatever we do, people will always have the means to obstruct it if it is not within what they want to do. And so what we're doing is we're gutting something that helps protect environmental justice communities and ignoring the fact that wealthy people will do whatever they want, regardless of whatever regulations exist.
Okay, thanks. Other questions?
Thank you so much for the illuminating dialogue. I wonder if we can talk a little bit more, considering we are in California, about possible ways of forging alliances with the tech worker movement, considering this enormous energy and water consumption by large language models lately, and they are also increasingly integrated into place-based industry like education and healthcare, and with telehealth and now increasing use of remote learning. And how do we respond to that and educate people about this enormous energy consumption? Thank you.
Maybe, yeah, let's get a few more in the mix. And then.
Okay. Do you have a question?
What you're having opened up the accessory dwelling unit process for infill housing, which automatically starts with a green environmental build, meaning that there's no fossil fuels being allowed to be used for the heating of such buildings. I've been following some forums, and apparently this movement really began in Portland and exported to Washington State, Oregon, here, but it's actually California that is leading the process. And I've installed 5 or 6 mini splits, which are heating units that use alternating current from the power pole and then converting it to DC using inverters. And they end up, if you follow the fans on those heaters, they spin very slowly when there's a low heat demand. But when there's more of a heat demand, they speed up. So they're pennies on the dollar for heating a structure. And if you have an insulated structure to begin with, you're solving a lot of problems here. You've got a street that already has poles and sidewalks, and then you're creating little units that people can actually purchase using the SB 9 laws. And so you can have, developments that don't involve tearing down, more farmland, or you're creating density within a. So anyway, I wonder if you think that this is a positive movement for California.
Okay, one more.
I was thinking of the word transition, and there's some researchers such as historian Jean-Baptiste Fresseau that question the very use of the word transition, because he says there's never been a transition. It's always been different forms of energy adding to each other, and he thinks it's kind of a liberal thing. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, I would really love to hear your thoughts about the question of communities that are protesting when large-scale sustainable energy installations are being depicted on the territory, and also of those who think, because this is an ongoing debate, those who think that the energy we are currently using cannot be fully replaced by green, sustainable energies. And, that's kind of some thoughts I was wondering about your opinion. And thank you very much for a really, really exciting book.
Okay, cool. I think the AI question. Another. Can you hear me? And another example of another split, I think, in the climate movement, where some folks think, there's these nuclear power plants, for instance, that are restarting to power Microsoft's AI. And there are coal-fired power plants that have been brought back online to power Bitcoin mining or cryptocurrency mining. And I think this is another reason why we have to think about fundamentally changing our systems and institutions, right? And more energy is not necessarily better just because we can produce it. And I think that, AI has really come about really uncritically in a lot of ways when it is a really huge water and energy source. And so I think any organizing that can be done with tech workers to kind of think about the role of AI, particularly in like sustainability and in energy use, is really important. In terms of whether or not renewable energy can displace all fossil fuel energy, I think sometimes we wait till there's a totally perfect plan before we think that it can be done. But even if we say we displace 80% of fossil fuel use, which is totally doable with currently the existing technology, that's a broad consensus. I think that would be so much more of a advancement than what we are currently doing. I would agree that there actually hasn't, I guess maybe we could say we transitioned away from using whale blubber. I do think that is true, but it is true that we have kind of just been energy addition. We've just been using more and more energy, which is why I think, again, arguing for systems changes and structures is really important, because we actually, when I first started doing climate work, energy efficiency was a huge issue, and people were talking about retrofitting all the buildings, and that has largely been lost in this abundance narrative. But the best way to transition away from fossil fuels is to reduce how much energy we are using, so that we have to produce less energy. And I think that often gets lost in this kind of idea that we can do whatever we want to do, and it's fine as long as it's renewable.
Sticking on the renewable thread, I think there are clearly better and worse places to build a lot of renewable energy. And one of the strange side effects of having a lot of landscapes in California and around the world that have been like super gutted and lost a lot of their biodiversity due to industrial uses or fossil fuel production is those often tend to be really good places to do a lot of renewable energy. And in California, in the San Joaquin Valley, it's a lot of what has been industrial agriculture land that has been poisoned, in many cases salinated by that use for a century, that is now getting turned into solar. That's something that it seems like a lot of people can agree, including like hardcore environmentalists, are like, if there's going to be a place to do it, this makes sense. I think there are going to be hard choices in what's coming. Like already a lot of like, we are not winning this fight currently, and so like we should have high standards for what we're trying to get to, but accept that we have not yet brought people together around what that is, and that when we bring people together, it's going to be different than what we imagine now. I think that's part of the spirit of like the diverse, broad coalitions vision that you have in this book, is like our vision needs to be based not just on what like we in this room can come up with, or what we can come up with in like a wish list in a Google Doc, but through a process of building with a lot of people whose input and imagination has not yet been brought to the table. Yeah.
Yeah, I meant to also say, the opposition, I think, also comes from the fact that those projects are just put on people, right? They're not developed with communities. And there's a lot of research that shows that when you develop these projects with community, you actually can overcome a lot of this opposition. But when you just tell people what's going to happen, that's when you really start to see a lot of opposition increase.
I'm getting the hook that we need to wrap up. I just want to quickly address the housing question. Crucial piece of this whole transition question, or like climate question, especially given the long commutes thing we've talked about, is doing more infill development, building a lot more densely close to where people work. I mean, more ADUs sounds good to me, but I think bringing this back to the labor and sort of non-reformist reform question, residential construction is where unions have been the most routed and destroyed by the construction industry for the past 50 years. Like that was the crux of breaking building trades unions, was getting them out of residential construction. So I think as we're thinking of strategies to like build more housing, we need to be thinking of ways to like expand the labor movement in that space too, because it would dramatically change the politics of the building trades if we could do so. Right now, the major splits in the building trades in California in the last few years have been over housing politics and basically who's going to take lower standards to get a little chunk of the work. I think, yeah, we need to try and build that in. Okay, let's tie this together and go talk. Looking forward to meeting a lot of you. Thank you so much, Mijin and the Center for hosting us.
Thank
Thank you.
So it's great. Thank both of you. Just wonderful. So again, they'll be available to sign books. So again, 2 for 1 on the books. And again, thank you. Please join us for a reception for the food. You can go out there and bring it back. And let's try to make this conversation work across these differences. Thanks everyone for coming out.